We all set goals, right? In business and life, whatever. But things don't always go as planned.
Oh, tell me about it.
So that's where knowing how to deal with risks comes in. And that's what enterprise risk management, or ERM, is all about.
Yeah, ERM. It's not just about avoiding those risks. It's about making sure the way you handle those risks actually helps you reach your goals. It's about making risk work for you.
Okay, so aligning those protective measures with your ambitions.
Exactly. And the article you sent over by, what was his name? Pritesh Biswas.
Yeah.
He really gets into this idea of setting goals, objectives for ERM. And what's really interesting is how he presents it. It's not some boring bureaucratic thing, It's like a core strategy to make risk management a real driver of success.
Yeah, and that's what we're diving deep into today. We're going to give you a clear picture of how to set these ERM objectives and then actually use them.
It's about building a solid foundation for your organization. So it's not just about weathering the storms. It's about actually seizing those unexpected opportunities when they pop up.
Okay, so we're talking about building resilience and making the most of unexpected situations.
Absolutely. And to really break this down, we're going to look at the 3 levels of ERM objectives that Biswas talks about. We've got strategic, tactical, and operational.
Right.
Each one is crucial, and seeing how they all fit together is where the magic happens.
Okay, so let's start with the big picture stuff, the strategic objectives.
Right.
In ERM, what are these long-term goals really all about?
So strategic objectives in ERM, these are like your organization's long-term ambitions, the goals that span maybe 3 to 5 years or even longer. And they're really deeply tied to your core mission, your vision, and your overall strategy. So it's not about the day-to-day stuff. It's focusing on those really significant high-level risks that could impact, your long-term sustainability and growth. Imagine them as the broad pathways you need to navigate to really reach your ultimate destination.
So these are the kind of risks that could really change the game for an organization, like the big game-changing risks.
Exactly. The ones that can totally reshape the entire landscape. And Biswas gives some really good examples, like making sure your business can keep running smoothly, even if there's a huge disaster. That's strategic, right? Or think about expanding into new markets, like global markets, but you're dealing with totally different legal systems and political climates. That's a big one. Or even just keeping your competitive edge by staying ahead of, all the innovation and competition. And more, we're seeing this idea of achieving sustainable growth, really integrating those environmental, social, and governance risks, the ESG risks, into your business model. That's becoming a core strategic objective for a lot of forward-thinking companies.
Right, because those factors are only becoming more important. Okay, so these strategic objectives, they sound really big and complex. How do you even start to manage them?
Well, it involves a few different things. First of all, you really need to identify and prioritize those potential risks and the opportunities that sometimes come with them. Then you have to do scenario analysis and stress testing, basically, running simulations of different possibilities, even those unlikely but high impact ones, to really see what the consequences could be. And finally, you have to come up with clear risk appetite statements. This is super important. It defines, how much risk the organization is actually willing to take on to achieve those long-term goals. It's about setting those boundaries.
Right, because taking on risk is often necessary, but knowing where to draw the line is key.
Exactly.
So how do you then integrate these strategic objectives into an ERM framework? I mean, they can't just sit in a report on a shelf, can they?
No, definitely not. It really needs buy-in from the very top of the organization, and it needs to be built right into those core strategic planning processes.
Okay, so it's not a separate thing. It's part of the DNA of the organization.
Right. It needs to be woven into how decisions are made at the highest levels.
Okay, so what are the actual steps to make this happen?
Well, Biswas breaks it down into a few key actions. First, you have to define and align your strategic objectives. It's not just about saying, hey, here's what we want to do. It's about identifying those risks, both external, like regulations changing or the market going crazy, and internal, like maybe inefficiencies or cybersecurity issues. And like we talked about, figuring out your risk appetite and tolerance is super important right from the start.
And I think he used the example of expanding into a new international market, right?
Yeah, exactly. If you're thinking about doing that, you have to consider the risks right away. The legal complexities, the political situation, the culture of the new country.
Right.
And then you decide how much risk you're willing to take on to make that expansion happen.
Okay, so it's about like going into it with your eyes wide open.
Yes, exactly. Then the next step is to integrate ERM into your strategic planning. That means you bring risk analysis right into those key strategic discussions. Tools like SWOT and PESTLE analysis can be really helpful here. And scenario planning, like we talked about, is really valuable too. It's about consistently making those decisions with the risks in mind.
And he also gave the example of launching a new product, right?
Yeah, you wouldn't launch a product without thinking about what could go wrong. What if the market doesn't want it? What if we have production problems? What if the competition comes out with something better? ERM helps you think through all of that.
So it's like having a safety net, but it's also about being proactive and anticipating potential problems.
Exactly. After that, you need to develop those risk response strategies. It's not about avoiding all risk, but it's about having plans to mitigate those risks.
Okay.
What are you going to do if there's a natural disaster? What if a big regulation changes? You have to be prepared. And then you have to think about how some risks could actually be opportunities. Maybe there's a way to innovate and grow because of them.
Like with digital transformation, right?
Exactly. Big risks, but also huge potential rewards. Then, something that's really crucial is setting up clear governance and accountability. You need a framework that lays out roles, responsibilities, and who reports to whom. Risk committees are really important here, making sure everyone knows who's in charge of what when it comes to risk.
And I think he brought up the international market expansion example here again, didn't he?
He did, yeah. You need to know who is responsible for managing those specific risks that come with operating in a new country. Once you have that structure, you need to monitor and measure how you're doing with risk. That's where key risk indicators, those KRIs, come in. And those risk dashboards, they give you a clear view of the risk landscape.
It's like having a speedometer for your risk.
Yeah, exactly. And regular reviews are key too. Make sure those mitigation strategies are actually working.
He used the example of a financial institution's lending portfolio, right?
Hmm.
Are we seeing more defaults?
Yeah, are those KRIs flashing red and telling us there's a problem? But this isn't just a top-down thing. You need to build a risk-aware culture throughout the whole organization. That means training, communication, and leaders who show that risk management matters.
So it's about getting everyone on board.
Everyone, from the top to the bottom. And finally, you need to communicate how you're doing and share those risk insights. That means regular reporting, keeping stakeholders in the loop, and understanding how all this risk management is affecting your performance.
And again, thinking about that digital transformation example,
Yeah.
it's about keeping everyone informed about the risks and how you're handling them.
Exactly. Okay, so we've talked about those big picture strategic objectives. Now let's dive into the tactical ones.
Okay, so if strategic objectives are the long-term vision, where do tactical objectives fit in? What are they all about?
Right. So tactical objectives, these are your medium-term goals, usually spanning 1 to 3 years. They're like a bridge between those big strategic ambitions and what you do day to day.
Okay.
They're usually focused on specific departments or functions like finance, IT, marketing, HR. And their main purpose is to address risks that could prevent those departments from actually contributing to those big strategic goals. They're like the how that gets you to the what of your overall strategy.
So, like, if a strategic objective is to increase market share over the next 3 years, a tactical objective for the marketing department might be to launch a specific campaign to reach a new customer segment in the next year.
Exactly. And that campaign comes with its own risks. Will the message work? Are we following all the rules? Are we actually reaching the right people? Biswas has some other good examples too, like beefing up cybersecurity and IT to prevent those data breaches. That's tactical. Or improving supply chain resilience and procurement. That's another one. Strengthening internal controls in finance to prevent fraud. Or developing training programs in HR to keep employees happy and make sure everyone's following the rules. Those are all tactical objectives.
So they're much more specific and focused on a particular area of the business.
Exactly.
Okay, so how do you manage these tactical objectives effectively?
Well, it involves a few things. Each department needs to figure out its own risk tolerance, but they still have to keep the organization's overall risk appetite in mind. They also need to develop their own key risk indicators and metrics that are specific to what they do.
Right.
And really importantly, there needs to be good communication and collaboration between departments, because a risk in one department can easily impact other areas.
That makes sense. Everything is connected.
Right. So when it comes to actually putting these tactical objectives into practice, the first thing is to translate those big strategic goals into specific, measurable objectives for each department.
Okay.
It's like breaking down the big puzzle into smaller pieces. And you have to think about the specific risks each department faces in trying to reach those goals. And of course, always keep the overall risk appetite in mind.
I think you used the example of a manufacturing company expanding their capacity and how that would affect IT, operations, and HR.
Yeah, great example. IT needs to think about the risks of scaling up their systems, operations needs to worry about supply chain disruptions and production bottlenecks, and HR needs to plan for hiring and training more people. And all of that needs to be done within the context of the overall risks of expanding the business. After that, each department has to create its own risk response plans. So what are they going to do to mitigate those specific risks? For example, maybe finance tightens up its internal controls, or IT strengthens its cybersecurity.
Right.
They might transfer some risk through insurance, or they might create detailed contingency plans in case something goes wrong.
He talked about finance focusing on healthy cash flow and operations making sure their supply chain is resilient.
Exactly. Then you need to set up those departmental KRIs, those key risk indicators. These are like the early warning signs that something might be going wrong. You want to connect these KRIs to existing key performance indicators whenever you can. That way you're tracking both performance and risk at the same time.
So for IT, it might be things like system downtime or the number of cybersecurity incidents. And for HR, it might be employee turnover or compliance violations.
Right. Then you have to make sure that there's good communication and coordination between departments. This could be through cross-functional risk committees, shared databases, or even just regular meetings and workshops.
It's like making sure all the different parts of the engine are running smoothly together.
Exactly. After that, you need to assign clear responsibility for managing those departmental risks.
Right.
Someone needs to be in charge of monitoring them, managing them, and reporting on them. And you can even tie performance reviews to how well people are managing risk.
So for example, the marketing manager is accountable for brand reputation risks, and the operations manager is responsible for supply chain risks.
Exactly. Then you need to actually implement those risk control mechanisms. That might mean setting up internal controls, like financial oversight procedures or IT access controls. It could also mean developing clear, standard operating procedures that have risk management built right in. And you need to do regular risk audits to make sure those controls are working.
Like that example of the internal audit focusing on supplier risks for procurement.
Yeah. Good example. And just like with the strategic risks, you have to keep monitoring and reporting on those tactical risks. You track those KRIs, you prepare reports for management, and you do regular risk reviews at the department level.
So finance might provide regular updates on liquidity risk, and IT might report on cybersecurity risks.
Right. And finally, you have to be ready to adjust and adapt. Things change, the environment changes, and you have to be able to change with it.
He talked about the legal department having to adapt to new data privacy regulations.
Yeah, that's a great example. Okay, so we've covered the long term, the medium term. Now let's get down to the nitty-gritty operational objectives.
All right, so we've got our strategic vision, our tactical plans. Now it's all about the day-to-day, the operational level. What are these objectives all about?
Right. So operational objectives are your short-term goals, usually less than a year. They're very focused, often at the level of specific tasks or activities within individual teams. And the main goal here is to make sure those everyday tasks are done efficiently and, really importantly, safely.
Okay.
We want to prevent any immediate risks that could disrupt those daily operations.
So if a tactical objective is to improve the overall resilience of the supply chain, an operational objective might be to make sure that each shipment is checked for quality and leaves the warehouse on time every single day.
Exactly. It's all about the details, the nuts and bolts of how things actually get done. BizWaz has some great examples, making sure everyone follows workplace safety protocols every day, monitoring data handling processes in real time, doing regular maintenance on equipment, and keeping an eye on financial transactions for anything unusual.
So it's like making sure all the gears are turning smoothly and fixing any problems right away before they become bigger issues.
Exactly.
So how do you manage ERM at this level? It seems like it has to be really embedded in how people work every day.
It absolutely does. At this level, it's all about real-time monitoring, keeping a close watch on what's happening as it's happening. It's also about having clear standard operating procedures with built-in risk controls. And training, making sure everyone knows about the potential risks in their daily work, that's super important.
Okay, so concrete steps. How do we actually make risk management a part of everyone's daily routine?
First, you have to identify all the specific operational risks in each key process. You might use process mapping to really visualize the workflow, and then you use risk assessment techniques like FMEA or RCSA to really figure out where things could go wrong. You also need to figure out what type of risk it is. Is it human error, a system failure, a problem in the supply chain, a compliance issue, or something environmental?
He used the example of a retail company looking at risks in their supply chain, their inventory system, and the possibility of their point of sale system going down.
Right. Once you know the risks, you need to develop controls and mitigation strategies. That means designing internal controls, things like automated checks, separation of duties, standardizing processes, and having strict quality control. You also need to create plans to fix things when they go wrong, and you should always be looking for ways to improve the processes themselves to reduce risk.
And he mentioned things like automated quality checks in manufacturing and automatic backups in IT.
Yeah, those are good examples. Then, just like at the other levels, you need those key risk indicators, those KRIs, but these are going to be specific to those operational processes, and you want to connect them to your KPIs whenever possible. So you're looking at performance and risk together. Risk dashboards are really helpful for this, giving you that real-time view.
I remember he talked about a logistics department tracking delivery times and damaged goods as KRIs and connecting that to their overall on-time delivery KPI.
Exactly. And just like at the other levels, someone needs to be responsible for managing those risks, making sure the controls are in place and working.
He gave the example of a risk owner for patient safety in a healthcare facility.
Right. And building that risk-aware culture is really important at this level.
Because these are the people on the front lines.
They are. You need training programs. You need to encourage people to report risks without being afraid of getting in trouble. And leaders need to show that they care about risk management.
That example of training frontline employees in financial services to spot and report potential fraud, that was a good one.
Yeah, it shows how important this is. Then you need to be monitoring those risks constantly. You need real-time monitoring tools, regular risk assessments to spot new threats, and good incident management systems.
Like that example of using call center monitoring software.
Yeah, and then you need to do those audits and reviews regularly to make sure those controls are working the way they're supposed to. Internal audits, process reviews, and getting feedback from staff are all important.
So again, that example of an internal audit looking at the procurement process.
Right. And finally, just like with everything else, you have to be flexible. Things change, you have to adapt.
He talked about a healthcare team adapting to new data privacy rules.
Yeah, that kind of flexibility is essential.
Okay, so we've covered strategic, tactical, and operational objectives. But just having these objectives, is that enough? They have to be connected to the overall principles of risk management, right?
Absolutely. It's not just about having goals, it's about going after them in a way that acknowledges, understands, and manages the risks.
So how do we make sure they're aligned with those risk management principles?
Biswas lays out 8 key principles. The first one is to integrate risk management into objective setting right from the start. Think about the risks and opportunities before you even finalize those objectives.
Okay.
Do your risk assessments, make sure they fit with your risk appetite, and plan with those risks in mind.
He used that example of a bank thinking about expanding its lending portfolio. They need to think about the risk of loans going bad before they set those growth targets.
Right. The second principle is clear ownership and accountability. Someone needs to be responsible for not just achieving the objective, but also managing the risks that come with it.
So it's not just about hitting the target, it's about hitting it safely.
Exactly. And you can even tie performance incentives to how well people manage risk.
So like a project manager for a new product launch, being responsible for managing quality and compliance risks, not just getting the product out the door.
Exactly. Then the third principle is about making decisions with risk in mind. You shouldn't just focus on the potential rewards, you have to consider the risks as well.
Right.
Use those risk assessment tools. Prioritize objectives based on both risk and potential value, and encourage smart risk-taking.
He talked about using scenario planning before entering a new market.
Yeah, thinking through those worst-case scenarios. Principle number 4 is to set up those risk-aware KPIs and KRIs. You need those performance indicators to track your progress, but you also need those risk indicators to warn you about potential problems.
So if your goal is to improve customer satisfaction, you'd track customer feedback, but you'd also track complaints.
Exactly. Principle 5 is to be flexible. The world changes, things happen, and your objectives need to be able to adapt.
Right.
Do regular risk reviews, be ready to reevaluate your objectives, have contingency plans, and always be looking for ways to improve.
That example of a traditional retailer shifting to online sales because of the pandemic, that was a good one.
It really shows how important adaptability is. The sixth principle is all about creating that risk-aware culture.
Everyone needs to be on board.
Everyone. They need to understand why risk management is important, and they need to be committed to achieving goals in a responsible way. That means training, open communication, and recognizing people who do things right.
That manufacturing company example where they rewarded teams for safety as well as production, that was a good illustration.
Yeah, it shows you can do both. Principle number 7 is continuous monitoring and feedback. You need to track your progress, you need to track the risks, and you need to use that information to make adjustments.
So like an IT department tracking both system uptime and security incidents.
Exactly. And finally, principle 8 is to learn from your experiences. When you've gone after an objective, take the time to review how the risk management went. What worked, what didn't, and how can you do better next time?
So after a big IT project, you don't just look at whether it's on time and on budget, you also look at how well the risks were managed.
Exactly. By following these principles, organizations can make sure their objectives aren't just wishful thinking. They're grounded in a real understanding of the risks involved.
Okay, so bringing it all together, it's clear that setting those ERM objectives at all 3 levels is crucial for any organization that wants to not just survive, but thrive. And it's all about making sure those objectives are aligned with the principles of good risk management.
Absolutely. When you take these steps, you're building a more resilient, more adaptable, and ultimately more successful organization. You're ready for whatever comes your way.
So for you, our listener, think about this. Which of those 3 levels, strategic, tactical, or operational, needs the most work in your organization? And what's one thing you could do right now to start improving risk management in that area?
It's all about taking that first step towards a more risk-aware and a more successful future.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.